Before my sister walked down the aisle, my parents sent me a list of 5 non-negotiable conditions I had to meet just to be allowed to attend her wedding. They told me that if I completed every single one, they would graciously permit my presence. I just smiled, booked a one-way ticket for a luxury beach vacation in Malibu, and mailed them one final unforgettable gift. As my sister opened that gift in front of hundreds of elite guests, her smug smile melted into a scream of pure terror. My name is Meredith, and I am 34 years old. If you have ever been treated like your family's dirty little secret, while the actual monster was paraded around as the golden child, hit that like button, subscribe, and let me know in the comments where you are watching from. Because the revenge I served my family was not just sweet, it was legally binding. To understand how my family operates, you have to understand what I do for a living. I work as a forensic accountant at one of the top financial investigation firms in Manhattan. My daily life revolves around tracing hidden offshore accounts, dissecting fraudulent corporate tax returns, and exposing executives who think they are smart enough to hide stolen money. I live in a world of absolute facts, cold numbers, and indisputable evidence. I have spent the last 10 years building my career from the ground up, working brutal 80-hour weeks, and securing my own financial independence. My corner office overlooks the New York City skyline, a constant reminder of how far I have climbed since escaping my toxic family dynamic back in Boston. It was a rainy Tuesday afternoon, and I was deep into an audit for a major pharmaceutical merger when my personal phone buzzed on my desk. The screen lit up with an email notification from my mother, Catherine. The subject line read, "Conditions for Brittany's wedding." I paused, my fingers hovering over my keyboard. I had known my younger sister Brittany was getting married, but the level of communication from my family had been practically non-existent. They only ever reached out when they needed something, usually money or a convenient scapegoat. I took a sip of my coffee, braced myself for the usual emotional manipulation, and opened the email. Brittany is 30 years old, and she has been the undisputed golden child of our family since the day she was born. Growing up, my parents, Catherine and Harrison, orchestrated their entire lives around her happiness. If I won a state mathematics competition, my mother would quickly change the subject to Brittany's new cheerleading uniform. While I took out massive student loans and worked as a waitress to pay for my accounting degree, my parents took out a second mortgage to fund Brittany's lavish lifestyle, designer clothes, European vacations, and an endless string of failed startup ideas. She was a master of feeding off my achievements, constantly belittling my hard work while happily demanding a cut of my financial success. Now, she was marrying Donovan. Donovan is an incredibly brilliant 34-year-old African-American tech entrepreneur. He comes from a highly respected intellectual family with deep roots in philanthropy and business. He built his software company from scratch and sold it for a fortune. He is sharp, handsome, and genuinely kind. I had only met him twice, but it was immediately obvious that he was completely blinded by the flawless, innocent persona Brittany had constructed for him. She played the part of the sweet, independent, family-oriented woman, perfectly masking the deeply toxic reality of her true nature. I scrolled down to read the email, expecting a list of unreasonable requests, but what I saw completely defied logic. My mother had laid out 5 explicit conditions I had to meet to be granted an invitation to the ceremony. Condition 1 stated that I needed to wire $85,000 by Friday to cover specific catering and floral invoices. Her justification was written in bold font, noting that family supports family, and since I was single and childless, I had no excuse not to contribute to my sister's big day. Attached to the email was a highly questionable, poorly formatted invoice from a catering company I had never heard of. Condition 2 was equally insulting. My mother informed me that I was required to wear a pre-selected dull gray, shapeless dress she had ordered for me. She explicitly wrote that I was not allowed to wear anything tailored or elegant because she did not want me to overshadow the bride or look too corporate and intimidating. They wanted me to literally fade into the background, paying for the privilege of being their ugly duckling. I sat back in my leather chair and stared at the glowing screen. A normal sister might have cried. A normal daughter might have felt the crushing weight of rejection and broken down in tears at her desk, but I did not shed a single tear. Years of their emotional abuse had hardened me, and my training as a forensic accountant instantly kicked in. I did not feel sorrow. I felt a cold, calculating curiosity. I looked at the $85,000 demand again. I analyzed the sheer audacity of trying to extort nearly 100 grand from me, while simultaneously demanding I humiliate myself visually in front of high society guests. They were treating me like an endless ATM and a visual prop to elevate Brittany's status. My mind started racing. Something about the catered invoice felt incredibly wrong. The formatting was completely unprofessional for a vendor charging that kind of premium pricing. The numbers on the page seemed hastily thrown together, almost as if someone with no accounting background had typed them up in a basic word processor. I leaned forward and scrutinized the attachment closer. It lacked a proper corporate tax identification number, and the address listed was located in a strictly residential neighborhood in New Jersey. Why would my mother be handling this specific invoice, and why would she demand I wire the money directly to an account I did not recognize, rather than paying the vendor myself? The request reeked of desperation and deceit. My mother had always favored Brittany, but she had never attempted financial extortion of this magnitude before. This was new territory even for her. It was clear that Donovan's vast wealth had elevated their greed to an entirely new level. They saw his fortune and wanted to present themselves as equals, hiding their own financial inadequacies behind a facade of luxury. At that moment, I realized this wedding was not a celebration of love. It was a meticulously crafted theatrical production designed to secure my sister a permanent place in a wealthy, powerful family. My mother's email was just the opening act. She wanted my money to fund the illusion and my humiliation to guarantee Brittany remained the center of attention without any competition. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the bustling streets of Manhattan down below. The city moved with a chaotic but predictable rhythm, much like the financial systems I investigated every day. People lied, people cheated, people tried to hide their tracks, but the numbers always told the truth. The numbers never lied. I walked back to my desk and picked up my phone. I knew exactly what my mother expected. She expected me to call her in tears, to argue, to eventually cave in and offer a compromise, because that was the role I had always played in our toxic family dynamic. She expected me to seek her approval, to buy my way into the family gathering, to accept the gray dress as a punishment for my independence. But I was no longer the desperate teenager begging for my parents' attention. I was a woman who unraveled complex corporate fraud for breakfast. If my family wanted to treat my presence like a transactional business deal, I was going to treat them like a hostile corporate takeover. I forwarded the suspicious invoice to my personal secure server for further analysis. Later, I would dig into that business address and trace the routing number my mother had provided. Right now, I had to address the immediate threat. I hit reply to my mother's email, keeping my response brief and devoid of emotion. I simply wrote, "Message received." Let us discuss this over the phone. I needed to hear her voice. I needed to know how deep this deception went and exactly what other conditions she was preparing to drop on me. I dialed her number, my heart perfectly steady, as the line rang once, twice, and then connected. Meredith, her voice dripped with artificial sweetness, masking the venom underneath. "I assume you have read my email and are ready to be a supportive sister for once." The manipulation was so blatant it was almost laughable, but I kept my tone entirely professional. "Yes, Mother, I have read the email," I said calmly. "But before we discuss the $85,000 and the dress, I need you to explain exactly why you think I would ever agree to these terms." I could hear her intake of breath, a sharp hiss of indignation that I dared to question her authority. She was entirely unprepared for the forensic audit I was about to unleash upon our family, and she had absolutely no clue that her list of demands would be the very thing that dismantled her golden child's perfect life. The line went dead silent for a fraction of a second before my mother dropped her artificial sweetness entirely. Her voice turned instantly icy, plunging the conversation into a freezing, calculated tone she reserved for unruly subordinates. "Excuse me?" She snapped the syllables clipping together like shards of glass. "I am giving you the opportunity to actually be a part of this family for once, Meredith. You should be thanking me. I am not paying $85,000 for a highly questionable invoice," I replied, keeping my own voice perfectly level and devoid of the emotional reaction she craved. "And I am absolutely not wearing a shapeless gray sack to a black tie event. If you want me to attend, I will buy my own dress and I will book my own travel, but I am not funding a mysterious shell company." My mother let out a sharp, exasperated sigh. It was the exact sound she used to make when I was a teenager and asked for money to buy textbooks while she was busy funding Brittany's expensive cheerleading camps. "You have always been so incredibly selfish and unnecessarily difficult," Catherine hissed through the speaker. "Your sister is marrying into a prominent, powerful family. Donovan is a highly successful African-American entrepreneur, and his parents are esteemed academics. They expect a certain level of class unity and traditional family values. You throwing your weight around and refusing to help pay for the reception is exactly why we had to implement these rules. A reception invoice does not cost $85,000 unless you are importing truffles directly from Italy on a private jet," I pointed out. "I audit corporate budgets for a living, Mom. Do not play games with me." "Since you want to be so combative and hostile," she cut in sharply, entirely ignoring my logic, "we might as well cover the rest of the terms. Check your inbox again. I just sent the legal documents." I pulled the phone away from my ear and refreshed my email client. A new message had appeared containing a single PDF attachment. I clicked it open and my jaw actually tightened. It was a formal non-disclosure agreement. Condition 3 was staring me right in the face. The document explicitly stated that I was legally forbidden from discussing my career as a forensic accountant. I was prohibited from mentioning my Manhattan apartment, my independent wealth, or anything regarding my lifestyle with anyone at the wedding. Instead, the contract instructed me to tell any guest who asked that I did back-office administrative work and lived in a modest suburban rental. It demanded I downplay my entire existence. "You want me to sign a legal gag order to attend my own sister's wedding?" I asked, my voice dangerously calm. "You want me to lie to my future brother-in-law and his entire family about who I am and what I do?" "Yes," Catherine answered without a single ounce of shame. "Donovan's family is elite. We cannot have your intimidating, unwelcoming energy ruining Brittany's integration into their world. You always have to be the smartest person in the room, Meredith. You always have to show off your money and your aggressive New York lifestyle. Brittany needs to shine on her own day. We cannot have Donovan's parents comparing her freelance marketing career to your cutthroat corporate job. It makes her look completely inadequate." I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stop myself from laughing out loud. Brittany's supposed freelance marketing career was a complete fabrication. She spent her days shopping, posting highly edited photos on social media, and draining whatever credit cards my parents handed her. She had never marketed a single thing in her life other than her own fake persona. My mother continued, her voice gaining momentum as she laid out her grand design. "Which brings us to condition 4. If you agree to pay the invoice and sign the agreement, you will be seated at table 42. It is in the back corner of the reception hall near the kitchen doors. You will be seated with Cousin Gregory and Aunt Beatrice. You will remain at that table for the duration of the speeches and the dances." Cousin Gregory and Aunt Beatrice were the estranged family members nobody ever spoke to. They were notoriously loud, heavily intoxicated at family events, and universally avoided. By placing me at table 42, my parents were physically quarantining me. The back corner by the kitchen doors would be completely out of sight from the head table, the dance floor, and most importantly, Donovan's elite family. I would be a ghost at the event, present only to fund the extravagant bills. As I stared at the ridiculous legal document on my monitor, a profound realization washed over me. This was no longer just about wedding day jealousy or normal sibling rivalry. This was a highly orchestrated, calculated erasure of my existence. My parents were not just trying to dim my light. They were actively deleting my reality from the family narrative to protect a massive web of lies they had spun for Donovan. They had clearly sold Donovan and his esteemed family an absolute fantasy. They had painted a picture of an independently wealthy, perfectly harmonious dynasty where Brittany was the undeniable star and the dutiful daughter. My actual success threatened that entire illusion. My career as a forensic accountant was a direct threat to whatever financial facade my parents were projecting. If Donovan, a brilliant tech CEO grounded in logic and data, sat down and had a 5-minute conversation with me, he would instantly realize I was the only functioning adult in my family. He would see right through Brittany's superficial charm and my parents' pretentious lies. That was exactly why I had to be gagged with a non-disclosure agreement shoved into a dark corner and forced to wear a dull, shapeless dress. They needed me to look like the struggling, socially awkward sibling so their story remained intact. They needed my money to fund the con, and my silence to ensure the con succeeded. "I need an answer, Meredith," my mother snapped, bringing me back to the present moment. "Are you going to sign the paperwork and send the wire transfer, or are you going to prove once again that you are the selfish disappointment of this family?" I leaned back in my chair, letting my eyes scan the New York skyline one more time. I felt a supreme sense of clarity. The emotional manipulation that used to paralyze me when I was younger had absolutely no power over me anymore. I was a professional investigator, and my mother had just handed me the first piece of evidence in a massive family fraud case. "I will review the documents and give you my final answer very soon," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly detached. Before she could launch into another demand, I ended the call. I dropped my phone onto the desk and cracked my knuckles. It was time to start auditing my own family. I had barely pulled my hands away from the phone when the screen lit up again. The caller ID flashed with my father's name. Harrison never called me during business hours unless he needed something substantial or someone else had failed to bend me to their will. My mother had clearly run crying to him the moment I hung up. I took a deep breath and accepted the call. "Do not ever hang up on your mother again," Harrison boomed through the speaker, his voice vibrating with a sudden aggressive rage that echoed in my quiet office. "We are trying to include you in the most important day of your sister's life, and you are behaving like a petulant child. You will sign that non-disclosure agreement, and you will pay the catering bill. But that is not all. We are advancing the final condition." I leaned forward, resting my elbows on my desk. "A fifth condition now?" I asked neutrally. I assumed 4 was the limit for a wedding invitation. "This is not a joke, Meredith," Harrison snapped. "Your mother and I discussed the wedding gift. They are starting a new life, merging 2 powerful families. They need a quiet retreat. As your contribution, you are going to sign over the deed to your grandfather's beachfront cabin. I have already had my lawyer draft the transfer papers. They will be in your inbox by the end of the day." The sheer audacity of the demand felt like a physical blow, but I maintained my composure. The cabin in question was a gorgeous rustic property sitting on a prime piece of coastline in Rhode Island. It was the only asset my late grandfather had intentionally kept out of my parents' reach. He was a shrewd man who saw right through my father's financial incompetence and my mother's obsession with status. Before he passed away, he explicitly placed the cabin in a trust under my name. He called it my safety net because he knew my parents would try to bleed me dry to fund Brittany's lavish lifestyle. He knew they would mortgage it and lose it. "That cabin is not a wedding gift," I stated firmly. "Grandpa left that property exclusively to me. It is not yours to give away, and it certainly does not belong to Brittany." "It is family property," my father roared, his anger escalating to a fever pitch. "Your grandfather was old and confused when he made that ridiculous trust. He meant for that house to stay in the family, and right now, Brittany is the one building a family. Donovan's parents own a summer home in Martha's Vineyard. We cannot have Brittany entering this marriage without bringing a comparable real estate asset to the table. It makes us look weak. It makes us look like we do not have generational wealth. You are going to sign that deed over Meredith. You owe this to your sister." "I owe her nothing," I countered coldly. "And I am not signing over a multi-million-dollar piece of real estate so you can play pretend with a billionaire's family. The cabin remains mine. That is not up for negotiation. The silence on the line grew thick and dangerous. When my father finally spoke, his voice was laced with a chilling, vindictive threat. If you do not sign that deed, Meredith, I will tie you up in court for the next 10 years. I will hire the most aggressive estate lawyers in New York, and I will contest your grandfather's will. I will claim he was not of sound mind. I will drain your bank accounts with legal fees until you are forced to sell the cabin just to pay your bills. You think you are so smart with your corporate job, but you have no idea what I am capable of when you threaten this family's future. He was panting slightly, catching his breath from the tirade. You have 48 hours. You wire the $85,000, you sign the non-disclosure agreement, you accept your seat at table 42, and you sign over the deed to the cabin. If I do not have everything by Friday morning, you are dead to us. You will not just be uninvited to the wedding. You will be erased from this family, and I will see you in court. The line went dead with a sharp click. I slowly lowered the phone and set it beside my keyboard. The silence of my office felt heavy, pressing in on all sides. My father had just threatened to destroy me financially and legally over a wedding gift. But the intensity of his threat did not match the situation. You do not threaten a decade of devastating litigation just to give your favorite daughter a vacation home. You only make those kinds of desperate, frantic threats when your back is against a wall, when you are out of options, when you need a massive, tangible asset to save yourself from absolute ruin. My forensic instincts were now fully awake, buzzing with adrenaline. I turned my attention back to my computer monitors. I opened the email from my mother again and maximized the PDF attachment containing the $85,000 catering invoice. I stared at the document, my eyes scanning the margins, the font choices, the alignment of the numbers. Something was glaringly wrong. The company name was typed in a standard default font. The itemized charges were perfectly rounded numbers. There was no distinct logo, no proper breakdown of state tax, and the routing numbers were formatted incorrectly for a commercial business account. It looked exactly like a fake invoice created by someone who had never actually run a legitimate business before. It looked like a desperate amateur attempt at extortion. My family was not just trying to push me into an emotional corner. They were trying to rob me completely blind. And I was going to find out exactly why. 2 days later, my heels clicked against the polished marble floor of the ground-level lobby in my corporate building. It was Thursday morning, exactly 24 hours before my mother requested the $85,000 wire transfer. I was heading downstairs to grab an espresso and clear my head before diving back into my pharmaceutical audit. The lobby was filled with the usual morning rush of Wall Street analysts, corporate lawyers, and executives. It was a space designed to project power and order. That order shattered the second I heard a loud, aggressive voice shouting my name across the atrium. I turned around and saw my father pushing his way past a group of startled receptionists. Harrison had somehow bypassed the initial security checkpoint, likely by tailgating a large group of employees through the electronic turnstiles. He was marching directly toward me, and he looked entirely out of place. My father always prided himself on his immaculate appearance. He loved tailored suits and expensive watches. But the man storming across the lobby looked chaotic. His tie was loosened, his collar was wrinkled, and a visible sheen of sweat coated his forehead. He was clutching a thick manila folder in his right hand, gripping it so tightly his knuckles were white. "Meredith," he bellowed, causing several high-profile partners from my firm to stop and stare. I stood perfectly still. I did not flinch or take a step backward. I just watched him approach, assessing his erratic body language. "You have ignored every single phone call your mother and I made for the last 48 hours, he yelled, stopping just a few feet away from me. He slammed the manila folder against his thigh. "You think you can just hide in your fancy Manhattan tower and ignore your family? You think you can just refuse to do your part?" I kept my voice incredibly low and calm, forcing him to stop screaming if he wanted to hear my response. "I told you I would review the terms I said. I never agreed to a timeline, and I certainly never agreed to a surprise ambush at my place of work." He ripped the folder open and pulled out a stack of legal documents. He shoved them toward my chest, but I refused to take them. They fluttered slightly in his shaking hands. "These are the transfer papers for the Rhode Island cabin," he hissed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "I brought a notary who is waiting outside in my car. You are going to walk out there right now and sign this property over to your sister." I looked down at the papers and then back up at his bloodshot eyes. "You drove all the way from Boston to New York City to force me to sign away my grandfather's house in the middle of a corporate lobby?" I asked. "This is beyond pathetic, Dad." He stepped closer, trying to use his physical size to intimidate me. "You are a selfish, ungrateful daughter," he spat. "Brittany is about to secure her future with Donovan. She is marrying a profoundly wealthy, successful man, and she needs to look like an equal partner in this union. You are deliberately trying to ruin your sister's marriage because you are jealous. You have always been jealous of her charm, her beauty, and her ability to attract a man of high status. You want her to walk into that family looking empty-handed just so you can keep a vacation home you barely even use." I watched a bead of sweat roll down the side of his face. His breathing was shallow and rapid. He smelled faintly of stale coffee and panic. This was not the behavior of a proud father trying to secure a wedding gift. This was the behavior of a man who owed money to dangerous people. "If Donovan's family is as wealthy and elite as you claim," I replied smoothly, "then they do not care about a rustic beachfront cabin in Rhode Island. They care about liquidity. They care about actual capital. Something you clearly lack." His eyes widened in shock for a fraction of a second before the rage returned. "Sign the papers, Meredith," he demanded, raising his voice again so the entire lobby could hear. "Sign the papers, or I swear to God I will drag you through a decade of litigation. I will sue you for every penny you have ever earned. I will bankrupt you." I did not shrink away. I did not raise my voice to match his. Instead, I calmly raised my right hand and caught the attention of the head security guard standing near the front desk. I gave a subtle nod. The guard immediately signaled two other large men in dark suits who began moving swiftly toward us. "You have absolutely no grounds for a lawsuit, Dad," I said, my tone dropping to a freezing whisper. "Grandpa's trust is ironclad, and my legal team is vastly superior to whatever budget attorney you can afford right now. You are trespassing in a private commercial building, and you are making a public disturbance." The security guards arrived, forming a wall between me and my father. "Sir, you need to leave the premises immediately," the head guard stated, placing a firm hand on Harrison's shoulder. My father tried to shake the guard off, his face contorting with wild fury. "Get your hands off me," he yelled. "I am talking to my daughter. She owes this family. She owes her sister. Sir, walk toward the exit or we will call the authorities," the guard warned, stepping closer and physically maneuvering my father backward. As the guards forcefully escorted him across the marble floor, Harrison lost whatever remaining shred of dignity he possessed. He waved the transfer papers in the air, screaming at the top of his lungs. "I will destroy you, Meredith. I will sue you for every single penny. You are dead to us. Do you hear me? You are dead." I stood in the center of the lobby, completely silent, as the heavy glass doors closed behind him, cutting off his frantic screams. Several colleagues offered sympathetic glances, but I just smoothed the front of my blazer and gave them polite, reassuring nods. I turned around and walked toward the private elevator bank. Once the elevator doors closed and I was alone in the quiet steel box, my mind went into overdrive. I analyzed every single word my father had just screamed. I replayed the way his hands shook, the sweat on his brow, the absolute terror lurking behind his aggressive threats. My forensic training told me everything I needed to know. A father securing a wedding gift might send an angry email. A father trying to protect his favorite daughter's pride might yell over the phone. But a man does not drive 4 hours across state lines to ambush his estranged daughter with a notary waiting in a running car unless he is completely out of time. He did not want that cabin for Brittany. He did not care about giving her a romantic retreat or matching Donovan's family wealth. He needed the deed to my property because he needed immediate frantic cash flow. He needed a tangible asset to leverage for a massive loan. My parents were drowning in some kind of severe financial crisis, and they were using Brittany's wedding as a smokescreen to extort the funds they needed to survive. The fake catering invoice for $85,000 was just a desperate grab for quick liquid cash. The cabin was the ultimate prize designed to be mortgaged to the hilt. I stepped out of the elevator and walked briskly down the corridor toward my office. My family thought I was just a stubborn obstacle standing in the way of their perfect narrative. They had no idea they had just provoked a relentless investigator. It was time to rip the mask off their entire operation. I locked the frosted glass door of my office and lowered the motorized blinds. The ambient noise of Manhattan traffic faded into a dull hum, leaving me in complete isolation. I walked to my desk and booted up my secondary workstation, the dedicated terminal we use exclusively for high-level forensic data mining. I took a slow, measured breath. For 34 years, I had operated under the emotional burden of being a disappointing daughter. I had analyzed every cruel remark trying to solve the puzzle of my family's disdain. That ended today. I completely severed the emotional tether binding me to Catherine and Harrison. I was no longer a daughter seeking understanding. I was a senior forensic accountant, and my family had just become a target profile in a corporate fraud investigation. I opened my encrypted database access tools, starting with the simplest threads and preparing to pull until the whole fabric unraveled. When you investigate financial crimes, you learn very quickly that desperate people make careless mistakes. They leave digital footprints scattered across public records and property registers. Harrison thought he could intimidate me with volume and physical presence. He assumed I would be too frightened by his public outburst to look closely at the paperwork. He severely underestimated the analytical precision required to survive in my profession. I retrieved my personal tablet and opened the email Catherine had sent earlier. I downloaded the PDF attachment containing the catering invoice for $85,000 and transferred it to my secure server. I opened the file on my main monitor, magnifying the document to examine the granular details. I ignored the itemized list of imported caviar floral centerpieces and champagne tiers. Those were just flashy distractions meant to justify the exorbitant total. My eyes locked onto the header and footer where the actual anatomy of a business resides. The invoice claimed to be from an elite boutique event planning service called Prestige Culinary Designs. The logo was a blurry, low-resolution graphic that looked like a free stock image hastily downloaded from the internet. A luxury vendor handling a high-society wedding for a tech billionaire would have immaculate branding and clearly defined payment portals. This invoice simply listed a generic bank routing number and requested a direct wire transfer. I pulled the employer identification number listed at the bottom corner of the page. Fraudsters often use fake tax ID numbers, hoping the victim will just pay without verifying the entity. I entered the 9-digit sequence into the Federal Corporate Registry database and hit search. I watched the progress bar load, my mind running through various scenarios. The system pinged, confirming a match. The tax ID was real, but the corresponding data attached to it set off a blaring alarm in my head. The business profile appeared on my screen, and the red flags were immediately undeniable. First, I checked the registered address for Prestige Culinary Designs. They occupy substantial physical real estate. I cross-referenced the provided address with a commercial property database and pulled up the satellite imagery. The address did not belong to a commercial kitchen in an upscale district. It traced back to a tiny anonymous post office box located inside a rundown strip mall in a residential suburb of New Jersey. There was no physical kitchen, no staff, no actual business infrastructure. It was merely a drop point for mail and legal notices. I leaned closer to the monitor, highlighting the date of incorporation. The business had not been operating for years, building a reputation among high society clients. Prestige Culinary Designs had been officially registered exactly 92 days ago. 3 months. My sister had been engaged to Donovan for over a year. Elite wedding venues and top-tier caterers are typically booked 18 to 24 months in advance, especially for a high-profile event involving a tech entrepreneur. No rational, wealthy couple hires a catering company that did not even exist when they sent out their save-the-date cards. A newly formed company with a post office box address and amateur invoices was demanding an $85,000 wire transfer. In the corporate auditing world, we call this a phantom vendor scheme. It is one of the most common methods employees use to embezzle funds. They create a fake company, generate bogus invoices for services never rendered, and then funnel the payment directly into their own pockets. My mother was trying to execute a textbook phantom vendor scheme against her own flesh and blood. I typed the routing number from the invoice into my banking analysis software to determine which financial institution held the receiving account. It was a standard consumer checking account at a local retail bank, not a commercial business account. Every piece of data pointed to a frantic, hastily constructed scam. They needed cash desperately, and they had manufactured a fake wedding expense to extract it from me. I thought back to Harrison's sweaty face in the lobby, his absolute panic masquerading as rage. If they were running a phantom vendor scheme for the catering, what else was fake about this wedding? If they were willing to commit wire fraud to secure $85,000, why did they also need the deed to a multi-million-dollar beachfront cabin? The level of exposure they were risking was astronomical. You do not commit felony wire fraud unless you are facing a financial catastrophe so immense that the threat of prison seems less terrifying than the alternative. I needed to know exactly who was listed as the registered agent for Prestige Culinary Designs. I pulled up the state registration filings, bypassing the basic summary, and downloading the original incorporation documents submitted 3 months ago. I watched the PDF render on my screen line by line until the authorized signature block appeared at the bottom of the page. The truth was about to stare me right in the face. The name printed in crisp black ink across the authorized agent line was Brittany. The digital signature perfectly matched the loopy, overly stylized handwriting my sister had used since high school. The registered corporate address for Prestige Culinary Designs was not a commercial kitchen or an event planning headquarters. It was the exact street address of Brittany's luxury downtown apartment. The very same apartment my parents claimed they were heavily subsidizing because her freelance marketing career was just getting off the ground. I sat back in my chair and let the cold, hard reality wash over me. There was no actual caterer. There was no florist. There were no imported truffles or towering champagne glasses requiring immediate payment. My parents and my sister were actively conspiring to extort $85,000 in clean post-tax cash directly from my bank account into Brittany's personal checking account. They were using the emotional leverage of a wedding invitation to facilitate a blatant act of wire fraud. Catherine's email was not just a toxic mother making unreasonable demands of her estranged daughter. It was a coordinated criminal conspiracy. They had specifically chosen a figure just under the threshold that might trigger automatic banking investigations for large corporate transfers, but large enough to solve whatever immediate catastrophic crisis had sent my father sweating and screaming into my lobby. I stared at the glowing monitor, analyzing the sheer audacity of their plan. They had weaponized my lifelong desire for family acceptance. They calculated that my desperation to finally be included in a major family milestone would override my professional common sense. They relied on decades of established family dynamics, assuming the conditioned response of an obedient, approval-seeking child would blind me to the obvious financial red flags. They thought they could bully me into submission with threats of social isolation and public embarrassment. They were dead wrong. I was no longer the scapegoat they could manipulate at will. I was a senior forensic auditor, and they had just handed me the smoking gun on a silver platter. My focus instantly shifted from my own bank account to a much larger, much more lucrative target. If my parents and sister were brazen enough to attempt a phantom vendor scheme on me, a professional who literally investigates financial crimes for a living, what on earth were they doing to Donovan? The realization hit me like a freight train. Donovan was not just a wealthy groom. He was a self-made tech entrepreneur worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was a walking goldmine, and he was stepping blindly into a family dynamic he completely misunderstood. Donovan was brilliant in the boardroom, but he was clearly naive when it came to the predatory nature of social climbers. Brittany had spent the last year wrapping him in a carefully constructed web of lies. She played the part of a successful, independent woman from a wealthy, established family flawlessly. Donovan probably believed he was marrying into a respectable high society dynasty. My parents played their roles perfectly, projecting an image of generational wealth and refined elegance while hiding their complete financial ruin. They had sold him an absolute fantasy, and he had bought it completely without hesitation. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together in my mind, illuminating the true purpose behind the absurd conditions laid out in my mother's initial email. The demand to sign a strict non-disclosure agreement. The bizarre requirement to wear a drab, shapeless dress. The forced isolation at table 42, hidden away by the kitchen doors. None of that was merely about Brittany's fragile ego or typical bridal vanity. It was a highly calculated containment strategy. They were absolutely terrified of me. They knew that if Donovan and I sat down for a simple 5-minute conversation at the rehearsal dinner, the entire charade would collapse instantly. Donovan would politely mention my father's booming real estate empire, and I would stare at him blankly, knowing my father's business went bankrupt years ago. He would bring up Brittany's successful marketing firm, and I would ask what firm he was talking about. My mere presence, unscripted and unmuzzled, was a lethal threat to their entire operation. They needed my money to plug a massive immediate leak, but they desperately needed my silence to protect the main pipeline. Donovan was the pipeline. He was the ultimate mark. I stared at the incorporation document on my screen, feeling a profound sense of duty taking over. This was no longer just family drama or petty sibling rivalry. I was actively witnessing a massive, ongoing financial crime against an innocent man. As a licensed accounting professional, I had a moral and legal obligation to uncover fraud. As a sister, I was officially crossing the point of no return. If I proceeded with this investigation, I would be declaring absolute war on my bloodline. I would be destroying my parents' reputation, dismantling my sister's wedding, and effectively erasing any chance of future reconciliation. But thinking back to the years of emotional abuse, the constant belittling, the way they looked at me with pure disdain, I felt absolutely zero hesitation. They had made their choice when they tried to rob me. Now I was going to make mine. I closed the state registry window and opened a new secure workspace on my terminal. I needed to map out the entire financial landscape of Donovan's tech empire and his personal investment portfolios. I had to see exactly where my family had attached their parasitic hooks into his wealth. The $85,000 they tried to extort from me was just a drop in the ocean compared to what they were likely siphoning from him. I needed to find the real hemorrhage. I adjusted my keyboard, took a sip of my cold coffee, and began to type. The hunt was officially on. My personal cell phone vibrated violently against the polished wood of my desk, shattering the intense silence of my office. I glanced away from my workstation. The screen was flooded with rapid-fire notifications. Brittany was losing her mind. I picked up the device and unlocked it, watching a massive wall of green text messages populate the screen. My sister was unleashing a desperate, frantic barrage of digital harassment. "Where is the signed NDA?" The first text read. "Mom said you hung up on her. You are ruining everything as usual." Before I could even process the first message, 3 more slammed into my inbox. "You need to wire the cash by noon tomorrow, or I am telling Donovan you are entirely uninvited. You have always been completely socially unfit for these kinds of high-class events, Meredith. You embarrass us. You have no idea how to behave around people with actual wealth and status. You just want to sit there and judge me because you are a miserable corporate drone who cannot find a man. Sign the paperwork right now. You have always been a threat to my happiness, and I will not let your toxic jealousy destroy my wedding. Send the money." I read the words with absolute clinical detachment. Years ago, that kind of vitriol would have stung. It would have sent me into a spiral of self-doubt and guilt. I would have drafted a dozen different apologies trying to explain my side, trying to bridge the massive gap between my reality and their delusion. Now those texts just looked like the frantic flailing of a cornered animal. Brittany was panicking because her phantom vendor scheme was stalling. She needed the $85,000 to cover whatever actual catastrophe was looming over my parents, and she needed my signed silence to ensure Donovan never learned the truth. I placed the phone face down on my desk, entirely ignoring her demands. The hunt I had just initiated required my absolute focus. A sharp double knock on my frosted glass door broke my concentration. Before I could answer, the door swung open, and David, the senior managing partner of the firm, stepped into my office. David was a rigorous, no-nonsense veteran of the financial sector. He only personally delivered case files when the stakes were extraordinarily high. He closed the door behind him and locked it, signaling that this conversation was strictly confidential. Meredith, he began, taking a seat in the leather chair opposite my desk. I need you to drop whatever routine audits you are currently handling. Reassign them to the junior associates immediately. I have a Tier 1 priority case that requires your specific expertise. I sat up straighter, my professional instincts taking over. What is the situation? We have just been retained by a massive international conglomerate, David explained, sliding a thick, sealed red folder across my desk. They are in the final stages of acquiring a highly prominent venture capital firm based right here in Manhattan. It is a multi-billion-dollar merger, the kind that makes headlines globally. But the acquiring board is extremely cautious. They want an exhaustive microscopic forensic due diligence audit on the venture capital firm before any ink hits the paper. Standard acquisition protocol, I noted, eyeing the red folder. Not entirely, David corrected, leaning forward. They do not just want the corporate ledgers scrubbed. They want a complete invasive audit of the CEO's personal financial footprint. Every bank account, every offshore trust, every real estate holding, and every single wire transfer he has made over the last 36 months. They need absolute certainty that this CEO has zero hidden liabilities, no undisclosed debts, and absolutely no personal vulnerabilities that could result in blackmail or public scandal. The acquiring board wants a guarantee that his personal life is completely bulletproof. I nodded, understanding the gravity of the assignment. When billions of dollars are on the line, personal indiscretions or financial leaks can tank a merger overnight. You want me to tear his life apart looking for leaks? Exactly, David said, standing up. I assign this to you because you are relentless. You do not miss a single misplaced dollar. I need you to find every skeleton in this man's closet before the acquiring company does. The digital access codes are in the folder. Get to work. David unlocked my office door and stepped out, leaving me alone with the sealed red dossier. I stared at it for a long moment. My mind was still partly occupied by my family's fraudulent catering invoice and the $85,000 extortion attempt, but I knew how to compartmentalize. I reached forward, broke the security seal on the folder, and pulled out the primary dossier. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stock paper containing the secure login credentials for the CEO's entire financial network. I turned back to my primary monitor, opened our firm's heavily encrypted gateway, and typed in the provided alphanumeric sequence. I hit enter. The progress bar loaded, verifying my security clearance. The screen blinked twice, and then the complete profile of the venture capital firm's CEO populated my monitor. My eyes scanned the top of the page, moving past the corporate entity name and landing directly on the high-resolution executive photograph attached to the file. I stopped breathing. The air in my office felt like it had instantly vanished. Staring back at me from the screen, wearing a sharp, bespoke suit and projecting an aura of absolute confidence, was a face I recognized immediately. It was the brilliant African-American tech entrepreneur. It was the man my sister was supposed to marry in less than 48 hours. The CEO of the venture capital firm was Donovan. I sat perfectly still, my eyes locked on his smiling photograph. The universe had just aligned in a way that felt almost supernatural. My parents had spent the last week desperately trying to silence me, attempting to force me to sign a non-disclosure agreement so I would never speak a word about my career or their lies to Donovan. They wanted to bury me in the back corner of a reception hall to protect their massive financial con. And now, sitting on my desk, fully authorized by international corporate law, was the key to Donovan's entire financial existence. My firm had just been paid a small fortune to perform an invasive microscopic audit on the exact man my family was actively defrauding. I did not need to break any rules to expose them. I had just been given a legally binding mandate to tear my family's lies to shreds. I placed my hands on my keyboard, a cold, fierce smile spreading across my face. I placed my hands on my keyboard and felt a cold, fierce smile spreading across my face. Soon my calendar chimed for the introductory briefing. David scheduled a secure video conference to establish parameters for the forensic audit. I adjusted my blazer, ensured my background was a blur of Manhattan skyscrapers, and joined the virtual boardroom. The screen divided into a grid. David sat in his office alongside two corporate attorneys in Silicon Valley. Then the final square populated. Donovan sat at a heavy mahogany desk, his posture impeccably straight. He looked exactly like the man who had shaken my hand at a brief family dinner 6 months ago, where my mother had actively talked over me. David began the introductions. Donovan, meet the lead auditor for this acquisition. She is our absolute best and will handle your personal financial deep dive. This is Meredith. Donovan glanced at the screen. He heard the name, but his expression remained relaxed, likely assuming it was a coincidence. Then his eyes shifted to my video feed. I watched the exact millisecond his brain processed my face. His polite corporate smile faltered. His brow furrowed in genuine confusion, and he leaned closer to his webcam. The man my sister was marrying, the man told I was an unstable, unemployed burden struggling to pay rent, was currently staring at me in a high-stakes corporate boardroom where I commanded the audit of his billion-dollar empire. Meredith, Donovan said, his voice betraying a sliver of shock. He recovered quickly, smoothing his features back into an executive mask. It is a pleasure to meet the firm's top auditor. Your name is quite familiar. The pleasure is mine, Donovan, I replied, radiating absolute authority and professional distance. I did not flinch or offer a knowing smirk. I treated him exactly as I would any elite client. We have significant ground to cover today to ensure the acquiring board is fully satisfied with your personal liability profile. I will need unfettered access to your private holding companies and your individual tax filings for the past 36 months. Donovan stared at me. He was clearly attempting to reconcile the fiercely competent woman commanding this meeting with the pathetic, jealous sister Brittany had painted me to be. Brittany had fed him a narrative where I was socially unfit, incapable of holding down a job, and desperate for handouts. Yet here I was dictating terms to him in a room full of highly paid lawyers. You will have whatever you need, Meredith, Donovan answered, his eyes never leaving my video feed. He was intrigued. The narrative he had been sold was already fracturing. Excellent, I said smoothly, transitioning into the intake protocol. To expedite the process, I need to establish a baseline of your current external financial obligations. Are there any outstanding personal loans, significant recurring gifts to family members or joint ventures that are not explicitly listed under your primary corporate umbrella? I silently watched Donovan process the question. He was a smart man and appreciated directness. My personal liabilities are minimal, Donovan explained calmly. However, I do have recent capital outlays tied to my future in-laws. I prefer absolute transparency in these audits. I recently allocated a substantial sum toward a joint family real estate investment with my future father-in-law, Harrison. He runs a highly lucrative property development firm. It was a private buy-in to secure equity. My hands rested completely still on my desk. I kept my face impassive, projecting nothing but polite professional interest. Harrison had not owned a multi-state property development firm in over a decade. His former business had collapsed entirely, leaving him drowning in debt. He was currently living off whatever credit cards my mother could still open. I see, I replied, typing a quick note on my encrypted terminal. And this joint venture is structured through his primary real estate holding company. Correct? Donovan nodded. Harrison's portfolio is extensive. He has been mentoring me on physical asset diversification. My fiancée Brittany is also an independent trust fund beneficiary, but she prefers to keep her marketing firm's revenue separate from my accounts, which I respect. She insists on pulling her own weight financially. The sheer scale of the illusion hit me with staggering force. An independent trust fund beneficiary, a successful marketing firm, a lucrative property empire. My family had engineered a comprehensive, sophisticated financial fantasy. They convinced a tech billionaire that they were an established, wealthy dynasty capable of matching his status. Donovan handed over his money, believing he was entering a mutually beneficial investment with a titan of real estate. He believed he was marrying a self-made woman who did not need his wealth. He was a man who valued logic and data, but had been emotionally manipulated by a masterclass in social climbing. My mother and father played upon his desire for traditional family values and his respect for self-made success. They mirrored his ideals right back at him to gain access to his accounts. "Thank you for the transparency, Donovan," I said, my voice steady and reassuring. "I will need the routing numbers and transfer dates for that specific real estate allocation. It is standard procedure to verify the receiving entity, so the acquiring board knows your capital is parked in a legitimate appreciating asset." Of course, Donovan agreed, signaling his lawyers to provide the data. "I appreciate your thoroughness, Meredith. I was told you were relentless, but I had no idea how sharp you truly were." The irony in his statement was heavy. He still thought the Meredith on his screen was a bizarre anomaly, a successful twin to the failure he had heard about. He did not yet realize that the failure was a complete fabrication. "Thoroughness is my job," I stated, wrapping up my portion of the meeting. "I will review the transfer logs tonight. We will reconvene tomorrow to discuss any preliminary findings." As the video call finally ended and the little squares vanished from my screen, my office returned to total silence. I had the confirmation I needed. The catering invoice was child's play. My family orchestrated a massive high-yield con against an innocent man, and they were using the impending wedding as the final lock on the vault. If Brittany married him, the finances would blend and the scrutiny would vanish. They needed the ceremony to happen at all costs. I opened the secure file Donovan's lawyers had just uploaded. I was going to follow his money straight into the heart of my father's lies. I opened the secure file Donovan's lawyers had just uploaded. I was going to follow his money straight into the heart of my father's lies. The batch contained gigabytes of raw financial data from the past 36 months. I downloaded the encrypted folders and initiated my auditing algorithms. In forensic accounting, we look at the velocity of the money and the specific digital fingerprints left behind by every wire transfer. I dragged the master ledger onto my monitor and applied custom filters. I isolated his venture capital acquisitions, operational overhead, and philanthropic donations. I stripped away the legitimate noise, exposing the raw, outgoing personal transfers. I sat in the quiet glow of my monitors. My eyes darted across rows of alphanumeric codes hunting for specific prey. I configured parameters to flag any transaction connected to Boston or my parents' names. The system hummed before the screen flashed red, highlighting a cluster of transactions. A detailed transaction history expanded across the screen. A cold wave of absolute clarity washed over me as I found the artery my family was tapping. The recipient account was registered to a corporate entity called Harrison Heritage Holdings. The name was so painfully arrogant I almost laughed. I pulled up the detailed wire transfer logs. It was not a single lump sum, but a highly methodical, recurring series of financial injections. 6 months ago, Donovan initiated the first transfer for $50,000. The memo line attached to the wire read, "Initial capital injection, joint family real estate investment." 3 weeks later, another transfer processed. This one was for $75,000, marked as Phase 2 development funds. The pattern escalated in frequency over the following months, $100,000 here, $85,000 there. I highlighted the aggregated total. Over 6 months, Donovan wired a staggering $500,000 directly into my father's supposedly elite real estate development firm. $500,000 vanished into an account controlled by a man who could not manage his household budget. I leaned back in my chair and analyzed the narrative they had constructed to facilitate this massive extraction of wealth. Donovan genuinely believed he was buying equity in a booming multi-state property empire. He thought he was partnering with a seasoned titan of industry, a father-in-law who could mentor him on physical asset diversification. My parents had likely presented him with fabricated prospectuses, fake property portfolios, and imaginary returns on investment. They played on his respect for family business and his desire to integrate into a legacy. But I knew the absolute truth about Harrison Heritage Holdings. I did not even need to run a deep background check to know my father was a complete fraud, but my professional protocol demanded irrefutable verification. I opened a direct portal to the state corporate registry and typed in the entity name. The results populated instantly. Harrison Heritage Holdings was registered as a limited liability company just 7 months ago. It was established exactly 1 month before Donovan made his first $50,000 wire transfer. The timing was entirely premeditated. The corporate address listed on the filing was not a high-end commercial office building in downtown Boston. It was the address of a rundown strip mall accountant who likely filed the paperwork for a $200 flat fee. I pushed further, tapping into the National Property Tax Database. I ran my father's name and his new corporate entity through the system to audit his actual physical assets. The query searched across all 50 states, scanning for commercial deeds, residential properties, undeveloped land, and commercial leases. The search completed in under a minute. The results returned 0 matches. Harrison owned absolutely nothing. He did not own a multi-state real estate empire. He did not own commercial development sites. He did not even own the house he and my mother currently lived in, having quietly remortgaged it to the absolute maximum limit years ago. I knew for a fact that his previous minor real estate venture had catastrophically collapsed 5 years ago, leaving a trail of unpaid contractors and liquidated assets. He had spent the last 5 years surviving on a mountain of high-interest credit card debt, entirely enabled by my mother's refusal to accept their new reality. They were completely broke. They were drowning in financial ruin. Yet they were actively siphoning $500,000 from an innocent man under the guise of an elite family partnership. And Donovan, a brilliant tech entrepreneur who routinely navigated ruthless venture capital negotiations, had handed over his money without a second thought because he trusted the woman he loved. Brittany was the ultimate Trojan horse. She provided the emotional leverage required to blind a genius to a blatantly obvious financial scam. I stared at the $500,000 total glowing on my screen. This was the exact reason my father had stormed into my corporate lobby, sweating and screaming like a madman. This was the reason he was so desperate to force me to sign over the deed to my grandfather's beachfront cabin. Donovan's legal team was currently auditing his finances ahead of the wedding. Soon those lawyers would ask to see the physical assets and the return on investment for the $500,000 Donovan had transferred to Harrison. My father needed a high-value property to show them. He needed my grandfather's cabin to legitimize his fake holding company. Without my property to act as a shield, his entire house of cards would instantly collapse, and Donovan would realize he was marrying into a family of degenerate con artists. My parents were not just trying to push me into a dark corner at a wedding reception. They were actively trying to strip me of my only inherited asset to cover up a felony wire fraud scheme. They needed me to sacrifice my grandfather's legacy to protect their lies. I saved the transfer logs, the fake incorporation documents, and the zero-asset property search results into a secure master file. I had the motive. I had the method. I had the proof. Now I just needed to track exactly where that $500,000 had actually gone. I stared at the blinking cursor on my terminal, the stark reality of the situation settling heavily onto my shoulders. The dots were fully connected, forming a perfect, unbroken line of systematic deception. My parents and my sister were not just social climbers suffering from delusions of grandeur. They were active predators running a highly coordinated, massive financial con against a man who was about to legally bind himself to their chaos. Brittany was the glittering bait. Harrison was the fabricated vault. Catherine was the ruthless enforcer ensuring no loose ends ruined the illusion. And Donovan, the brilliant self-made billionaire, was their ultimate mark. As a licensed forensic accountant and a certified fraud examiner, I operate under a strict code of professional ethics. My firm had been retained by the acquiring conglomerate to conduct this exact type of invasive due diligence. Donovan was now officially a subject of my professional purview. I had a legally binding fiduciary duty to report any and all financial liabilities that could compromise this multi-billion-dollar merger. Discovering that the CEO was actively being defrauded of $500,000 by his future in-laws was a massive material liability. Failing to disclose this finding would not just be a breach of my professional oath. It would constitute active complicity in a felony wire fraud scheme and could expose my entire firm to catastrophic legal consequences. But fulfilling my fiduciary duty meant taking an action with irreversible personal consequences. I was staring down the barrel of a profound moral dilemma. If I reported this discovery to David and the acquiring board, I would not just be flagging a bad investment. I would be declaring absolute scorched earth war on my own bloodline. The moment I handed over this evidence, Donovan would cancel the wedding. He would call his lawyers. The authorities would be notified. The police would investigate Harrison Heritage Holdings and trace the wire transfers. My parents would face severe criminal charges. They could legitimately go to federal prison. Brittany would lose her wealthy fiancé, her fabricated social standing, and potentially face charges for the phantom vendor scheme. I would be the architect of their total destruction. I closed my eyes and leaned my head back against my leather chair. Was I truly prepared to annihilate my family? Society conditions us to protect our relatives at all costs. We are taught that blood is thicker than water, and that family loyalty must supersede everything else. I felt a fleeting moment of hesitation, a programmed urge to simply delete the files, recuse myself from the audit, and let Donovan discover the truth on his own after the wedding. It would be the easiest path. It would keep my hands clean. Then the memories began to surface, slicing through the hesitation like a razor. I remembered being 15 years old, standing at Gate 24 in the international terminal. My parents had planned a lavish tropical vacation to the Caribbean. They had packed their designer luggage and dressed Brittany in a brand new resort outfit. When we reached the security checkpoint, my mother pulled me aside, pressed $200 into my hand, and told me my ticket had been canceled. She explicitly said my awkward energy would ruin their luxury aesthetic. She abandoned me at the airport just to enjoy a flawless vacation with her favorite child. She walked away without looking back, leaving a 15-year-old girl to navigate a bustling airport and an empty house completely alone. I remembered the endless years of constant belittling. The countless family dinners where my father mocked my accounting degree, calling me a glorified human calculator while praising Brittany's non-existent marketing skills. I remembered my mother telling her country club friends that I was socially unfit and incapable of landing a husband. They had spent my entire life grinding my self-esteem into dust, ensuring I felt entirely dependent on their meager scraps of approval. And then I looked back at my monitors where the evidence of their current extortion attempt sat in high definition. They had the sheer audacity to demand $85,000 from me using a fake catering invoice to line Brittany's personal bank account. They demanded I wear a drab gray sack to physically diminish my presence at the reception. They tried to banish me to the furthest corner of the venue behind the kitchen doors, so I would not expose their lies to Donovan's elite family. The final insult burned the brightest. They demanded I sign over the deed to my late grandfather's beachfront cabin. They tried to steal the one secure asset a man who actually loved me had left behind. They tried to steal my safety net not out of love for Brittany, but out of a desperate, frantic need to cover up their felony fraud against Donovan. They were willing to bankrupt me to save themselves. The hesitation evaporated, leaving behind a cold, razor-sharp resolve. Blood does not excuse abuse. Shared DNA does not grant immunity from felony fraud. My family had never been loyal to me. They had only been loyal to their greed and their fabricated image. They had ruthlessly calculated that my desire for their love would keep me silent and compliant. They had bet their entire fraudulent empire on the assumption that I would remain the weak, eager to please scapegoat. They bet wrong. I opened my eyes and sat up straight. I chose the law over toxic loyalty. I chose my hard-earned professional integrity over a family that had abandoned me at an airport when I was a child. I chose justice for an innocent man who was about to be bled dry by parasites. Most importantly, I chose myself. I reached for my keyboard and prepared to dig into the darkest corners of my father's financial records. It was time to find exactly where Donovan's $500,000 had gone and gather the final pieces of ammunition I needed to execute a flawless, legally binding takedown. I opened the primary ledger for Harrison Heritage Holdings. The initial $50,000 deposit from Donovan sat at the top of the spreadsheet like a glaring beacon. In a legitimate commercial real estate firm, that capital would have been routed immediately into an escrow account or transferred to a verified title company for asset acquisition. Instead, the moment Donovan's funds cleared the holding account, the money fractured into dozens of erratic outbound transactions. The velocity of the money was entirely wrong for property development. It moved with the frantic, chaotic pace of a desperate debtor. I applied a tracking algorithm to follow the largest outbound wires. Over the course of 6 months, Harrison had funneled nearly $200,000 into shell corporations registered in Malta and the Cayman Islands. A quick cross-reference through our firm's International Financial Crimes database confirmed exactly what those offshore entities were. They were payment processors for illicit sports betting syndicates and unregulated high-stakes online casinos. My father was not a property mogul mentoring a young billionaire. He was a degenerate gambling addict aggressively trying to chase his massive losses with stolen capital. The financial bleeding did not stop there. I noticed a series of fixed weekly transfers to a domestic consulting firm operating out of a rundown strip mall in Nevada. The amounts were precise and always ended in odd integers, which is a classic hallmark of compounded interest payments. I ran the director of that consulting firm through a criminal background check. He was a well-known associate of a predatory lending ring. My father had borrowed heavily from high-interest loan sharks to cover his gambling debts, and he was using Donovan's venture capital money to keep his kneecaps intact and his creditors at bay. The remaining $300,000 had been systematically drained to fund the illusion of their high society lifestyle. I pulled the detailed transaction logs. There were massive weekly payments clearing the balances on my mother's platinum credit cards. The statements painted a sickening picture of vanity and unchecked greed. $10,000 went toward Catherine's exclusive country club dues, ensuring she could continue sipping cocktails with women she considered her peers. $15,000 was dropped at luxury bridal boutiques in Manhattan for Brittany's wedding fittings. $5,000 a month was automatically deducted for a leased Mercedes-Benz registered strictly in Brittany's name. Donovan was literally paying for the designer wardrobe my sister wore while actively seducing and lying to him. He was single-handedly financing the very wedding they were using to trap him permanently in their web. But a sudden influx of $500,000 usually leaves some kind of positive residue, unless the financial hole is impossibly deep. I needed to see the absolute origin of the crater. I logged into the federal court electronic records system. I bypassed the standard public queries and utilized my credentialed access to search for restricted financial judgments under my parents' names. The loading icon spun on my screen for 3 seconds before delivering the final devastating blow. 2 years ago, Harrison and Catherine filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. The documents had been sealed under a strict confidentiality request, likely negotiated by a desperate bankruptcy attorney trying to shield my father's remaining business contacts from the immense fallout. I unsealed the digital file and read the liquidator's summary. They were entirely destitute. The court had liquidated every minor asset they possessed just to satisfy their outstanding tax liabilities. The sprawling suburban home they currently lived in was essentially a prop. It was leveraged with a reverse mortgage drowning in missed payments and officially slated for foreclosure proceedings. For the past 24 months, my family had been living as absolute ghosts in the financial system. They possessed zero net worth. They had no credit, no assets, and no legitimate income. Their entire existence was a carefully curated mirage, held together by predatory loans and sheer arrogance. When Brittany managed to sink her claws into a billionaire tech entrepreneur, they hit the ultimate jackpot. They used his genuine desire for a traditional family connection to turn him into their personal, limitless, automated teller machine. This was the exact reason they needed my grandfather's beachfront cabin so desperately. Donovan's meticulous legal team was preparing for the prenuptial agreement and the final asset merger ahead of the wedding. Those elite Silicon Valley attorneys were going to demand to see the physical real estate portfolio Harrison claimed to be building with Donovan's $500,000. They were going to ask for property deeds, inspection reports, and yield projections. Harrison had absolutely nothing to show them but offshore gambling receipts and overdue credit card bills. If he could force me to sign over the deed to the Rhode Island cabin, he could present that multi-million-dollar property to Donovan's lawyers as the crown jewel of their joint investment. The cabin was the only thing on Earth that could legitimize the massive black hole in Harrison's ledger. It was the physical shield he needed to pass the due diligence audit. Without my signature, my family's entire criminal conspiracy was going to be exposed to a room full of aggressive venture capital attorneys. They were staring down the barrel of federal prison, and their only escape route was threatening me into blind submission. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the digital mountain of evidence I had just compiled on my encrypted server. I organized the offshore wire transfer receipts into a primary folder. I placed the bankruptcy filings into a secondary folder. I took the itemized credit card statements detailing Brittany's lavish shopping sprees, funded by stolen money, and grouped them together. Every single keystroke felt like driving a nail into the coffin of their fabricated dynasty. They had spent my entire life making me feel completely worthless. They had dismissed my intelligence and mocked my career. Now that very same career was the weapon that would dismantle their lives completely. I had the complete blueprint of their destruction perfectly documented, properly sourced, and ready to be deployed. I had caught them red-handed. The raw data on my screens illuminated the sheer depth of their depravity, but as I cross-referenced the timeline of the upcoming wedding, a more insidious layer of the fraud revealed itself. The demand for my grandfather's cabin was far more sinister than simply presenting a physical asset to Donovan's lawyers. Harrison did not just need a property to point at. He needed liquid capital to cover his tracks, and he needed it yesterday. My grandfather's cabin was entirely unencumbered. It had no mortgage, no liens, and no outstanding tax debts. In the world of high finance, a free and clear luxury property is essentially a massive blank check. Harrison was not planning to tell Donovan that the cabin was Brittany's wedding gift to live in. He was planning to take the deed forge, whatever remaining authorizations he needed, and immediately approach a predatory hard money lender. These unregulated private lenders operate outside the scope of traditional banking. They do not require extensive credit checks or lengthy underwriting periods. If you hand them a clean deed to a multi-million-dollar beachfront property, they will wire you millions of dollars in liquid cash within 24 hours. That was the true purpose of the fifth condition. Harrison intended to illegally mortgage my inheritance to secure an emergency cash injection. He needed to artificially inflate his completely barren corporate accounts. He had stolen $500,000 from Donovan and bled it dry through offshore casinos and luxury shopping sprees. Now the piper was demanding payment. Donovan was not a foolish man. He was entering into a marriage while actively managing a billion-dollar tech empire. His legal team would absolutely insist on an ironclad prenuptial agreement. A standard component of any high-net-worth prenuptial process is a mandatory schedule of assets and full financial disclosure from both parties. Donovan's wealth managers would demand to see certified bank statements and portfolio balances from Harrison Heritage Holdings to verify the joint venture was legitimate and intact. They would set a specific disclosure deadline, likely just days before the wedding ceremony. If Harrison produced bank statements showing a zero balance, the entire facade would instantly evaporate. Donovan's legal team would immediately flag the missing $500,000, trace it to the bankruptcy filings, and initiate criminal proceedings for wire fraud. Harrison's master plan was a frantic, desperate shell game. If I signed over the deed, he would secure the hard money loan, dump the cash into his empty corporate accounts, and generate a pristine bank statement showing millions in liquid capital. He would present that falsified snapshot to Donovan's lawyers, proving his status as a wealthy real estate tycoon. Once the wedding took place and Brittany was legally married to a billionaire, Harrison likely planned to use Donovan's ongoing financial proximity to slowly pay off the predatory loan and trap the cabin in a perpetual cycle of debt. The entire survival of their criminal enterprise hinged exclusively on my compliance. Without the deed to my grandfather's property, they had no collateral. Without collateral, they had no cash. Without cash, their bank accounts remained empty. And with empty bank accounts, Donovan's auditors would uncover the felony theft the moment they reviewed the prenuptial disclosures. The ticking clock was deafening. My mother had given me a strict 48-hour deadline to sign the transfer papers and wire the $85,000. The timeline was not arbitrary. It was a mathematical necessity. If the wedding was on Saturday, the lawyers would absolutely require the finalized asset schedules by Friday morning. Harrison needed the deed by Wednesday to secure the private loan and wire the cash into his accounts by Thursday. They were suffocating under the pressure of a deadline they could not control. Every aggressive phone call, every screaming match in my lobby, every condescending email from my mother was driven by the sheer terror of an approaching deadline. They were acting like trapped animals because they were quite literally out of time. If they failed to secure my signature, their luxurious house of cards would be replaced by federal indictments and prison sentences. I sat back and steepled my fingers, marveling at the colossal arrogance of their strategy. They had spent my entire life conditioning me to seek their approval, treating my need for family connection like a weakness they could exploit. They assumed my desperation to attend my sister's wedding would blind me to the financial logistics of their demands. They thought I would just sign the papers to buy my way back into their good graces. They completely forgot who I was. They forgot that while they were busy playing dress-up in country clubs and squandering their wealth, I was grinding through 50-hour work weeks in a Manhattan financial firm. I had spent a decade mastering the exact skills required to dismantle people just like them. They had inadvertently handed a loaded weapon to the one person on earth fully qualified to pull the trigger. My mind was completely clear. The emotional wounds of my childhood, the lingering sting of the airport abandonment, the constant comparisons to Brittany, none of it mattered anymore. Those feelings had been entirely replaced by the cold, sterile satisfaction of a perfectly executed audit. I had the complete financial anatomy of their fraud mapped out on my secure servers. I had the offshore transaction receipts, the sealed bankruptcy documents, the fraudulent catering invoice, and the timeline of their impending collapse. I did not need to scream or cry or engage in a pointless emotional confrontation. I just needed to let the clock run out. I gathered the digital files into a single encrypted master dossier. I labeled it with Donovan's venture capital firm name to ensure it complied with my professional fiduciary obligations. I was going to follow the strict protocol of my firm and present the findings to the acquiring board, but I was also going to deliver the truth directly to the source. My family wanted me to remain silent and invisible. They wanted me to fund their salvation while they pushed me into the shadows. Instead, I was going to step directly into the light and hand their billionaire Mark the exact documentation required to send them all to prison. The audit was complete. It was time to prepare the final presentation. The audit was complete. It was time to prepare the final presentation. I reached for my coffee mug, but my secondary secure phone illuminated the dark surface of my desk. It was an incoming audio message from Catherine. She had abandoned text messages, presumably realizing that written words left a permanent, undeniable paper trail. She mistakenly believed that a voice note sent through an encrypted messaging app would disappear or offer some level of plausible deniability. She had no idea how digital forensics actually worked. I tapped the screen and clicked play. Catherine's voice filled the silent office. It was not the polished, refined tone she used at country club luncheons or elite bridal fittings. It was a guttural, vicious sound dripping with absolute venom. "Listen to me, you ungrateful little brat." She began, her breathing shallow and erratic. "Your father told me exactly what happened in your lobby today. You think you hold the cards because you sit in a glass tower in Manhattan. You hold nothing. You have exactly 48 hours to sign that property transfer and wire the $85,000. If those funds are not in Brittany's account by Friday morning, I am calling the NYPD." I remained completely still, listening to the sheer desperation amplifying her voice. "I will file a formal police report stating that you stole the family's vintage diamond collection during your last visit home." She threatened, her tone escalating into a frantic hiss. "I will tell the detectives you took heirloom pieces worth over $200,000 to fund your pathetic, lonely lifestyle in the city. You know exactly how the police handle grand larceny. They will raid your pristine little office. They will drag you out in handcuffs in front of your entire firm and all your elite colleagues. Your career will be instantly destroyed. You will lose your professional license, your job, and your freedom. You sign the deed and you send the money, or I swear I will watch them lock you in a cell. 48 hours, Meredith. Do not test me." The audio message ended with a sharp click. I sat perfectly still, letting the sheer magnitude of her threat wash over me. She was willing to frame her own daughter for a massive felony just to secure the capital needed to cover up their fraud against Donovan. She was ready to destroy my professional life and my freedom to protect Brittany's fabricated narrative. A normal person would feel a crushing wave of panic or despair at hearing their own mother orchestrate their destruction. I felt nothing but the icy thrill of a prosecutor holding a signed confession. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear. I simply plugged a physical encrypted flash drive into my terminal. Using specialized audio extraction software, I bypassed the messaging app's auto-delete function and pulled the raw audio file directly onto my secure drive. I ran the file through a metadata analyzer, stripping the underlying digital signature that verified the exact time, date, and geolocation of the device that recorded it. The metadata confirmed the audio originated from my parents' suburban home. It was irrefutable, legally admissible evidence of felony extortion. Now it was time to assemble the ultimate weapon. I opened a new master folder on the encrypted drive. I named it Operation Horizon. I started dragging and dropping the pieces of their destruction into the file, methodically organizing the evidence to ensure maximum devastating impact. First went the incorporation documents for Prestige Culinary Designs. The files clearly showed Brittany as the sole proprietor of a phantom catering company designed exclusively to siphon $85,000 in clean cash. Next, I added the high-resolution copies of the fake invoice they had sent me alongside the digital footprint tying the corporate address to Brittany's luxury apartment. Then came the heavy artillery. I dragged over the complete transaction logs from Harrison Heritage Holdings. I highlighted the $500,000 Donovan had wired into the account in good faith, believing he was securing a real estate investment. Right below that, I placed the outbound transfer receipts tracking those exact funds directly into offshore sports betting syndicates and high-interest loan shark accounts in Nevada. The financial footprint was undeniable. I included the credit card statements highlighting the luxury bridal purchases and the luxury car lease payments, all funded by Donovan's stolen venture capital money. I pulled the sealed Chapter 7 bankruptcy filings from 2 years ago. I made sure the liquidator's summary was the first page visible, confirming my parents had absolutely zero net worth and were living entirely on predatory debt and stolen funds. This document alone would completely shatter the illusion of their generational wealth and elite status. It proved they were nothing more than desperate grifters preying on a brilliant man's desire for a traditional family. Finally, I dropped the audio file of Catherine's extortion threat into the master folder alongside the frantic, unhinged voicemails my father had left after his failed ambush in my lobby. I included screenshots of Brittany's abusive text messages demanding the signed non-disclosure agreement and insulting my social status. The folder was now a comprehensive, legally devastating dossier. It contained everything required to trigger federal indictments for wire fraud, embezzlement, extortion, and conspiracy. I reviewed the entire package one last time. I approached it with the same rigorous scrutiny I apply to billion-dollar corporate mergers. I anticipated every possible defense their cheap lawyers might attempt to raise, and I preemptively crushed those defenses with hard, verifiable data. The paper trail was flawless. The digital fingerprints were permanent. They had built a beautiful, glamorous house of cards, and I had just mapped out the exact structural weak points required to bring the entire thing crashing down on their heads. The 48-hour deadline my mother had so aggressively imposed was not a threat to me. It was a countdown to their own execution. They needed my money to pay the real wedding vendors who were likely threatening to walk out. They needed the deed to the cabin to pass Donovan's prenuptial asset review. Without my compliance, the wedding would implode before the first guest even arrived. I ejected the encrypted flash drive and slipped it into my pocket. The cold metal against my skin felt like the physical manifestation of justice. The audit was secured and the trap was fully set. I pulled my personal phone from the bottom drawer of my desk. The screen was already cluttered with a dozen new notifications from our family group chat. My mother had added a series of increasingly hostile countdown reminders regarding the deadline for the wire transfer. Brittany had chimed in with links to high-end floral arrangements she claimed were hanging in the balance because of my selfishness. My father had simply posted a photo of the legal transfer deed sitting on his desk with a pen resting ominously beside it. They were operating under the delusion that sheer volume would force my submission. They believed that if they yelled loud enough and threatened hard enough, my boundaries would crumble just as they always had when I was a teenager. I unlocked the device and opened the messaging app. I did not draft a lengthy defense of my character. I did not beg for their understanding or try to explain the financial reality of their impossible demands. I did not even address my mother's unhinged threat to frame me for grand larceny. Engaging with their toxicity only fueled their adrenaline. Complete compliance mixed with a strategic withdrawal was the only response that would blind them to my actual maneuver. My fingers moved swiftly across the digital keyboard. I typed a single concise response. I understand. I will not be attending, but I will mail a special final gift to the reception to make up for my absence. I hit send and watched the message pop into the chat. The read receipts appeared almost instantaneously. I could perfectly picture them sitting in the living room of their heavily mortgaged suburban home, staring at their screens. In their twisted reality, my message meant absolute surrender. They read my promise of a special final gift and immediately assumed I was sending the $85,000 cashier's check alongside the signed property deed for the Rhode Island cabin. They believed I had chosen to spare myself the social humiliation of the gray dress and table 42 by simply buying my way out of the event entirely. Their responses arrived seconds later, dripping with premature victory. Catherine sent a champagne toast emoji, followed by a brief message praising me for finally making a mature decision. Brittany responded with a simple peace sign and a sparkling heart emoji, adding a comment that she knew I would do the right thing for her special day. Harrison did not reply at all, assuming the financial victory was secured, and his looming debts would soon be eradicated. They were celebrating their triumph, completely oblivious to the fact that the trapdoors had just locked shut around them. I held the power button on the side of the device until the screen faded to black. I removed the protective case, popped open the tray, and extracted the SIM card. I dropped the tiny piece of plastic into the trash bin under my desk. That phone was my last remaining emotional tether to their world, and I had just severed it completely. From this moment forward, I was unreachable. They could not threaten me, extort me, or manipulate me. I turned my attention to the physical execution of my promise. I took the encrypted flash drive from my pocket and placed it inside a sleek, padded portfolio case. But a flash drive was too easy to ignore or lose in the chaos of a wedding reception. I needed a delivery method that guaranteed maximum visual impact without requiring anyone to plug a foreign device into a computer. I pulled a brand new high-definition tablet from my firm's secure hardware locker. I spent the next hour configuring the device. I disabled all standard operating functions and locked it into a dedicated presentation mode. I uploaded the comprehensive financial dossier directly to the local storage. I then programmed an automated script. The moment the tablet was powered on and the cover was opened, it would actively seek and hijack any unsecured Bluetooth audio-visual receivers within a 200-foot radius. High-end wedding venues always utilized wireless projection and sound systems for speeches and slideshows. The tablet was designed to forcefully pair with those systems and broadcast its contents to every screen and speaker in the room. I placed the tablet and the printed executive summaries into a beautiful velvet presentation box. I enclosed a heavy cardstock envelope addressed simply to Brittany and Donovan. I sealed the velvet box inside a premium shipping container and printed a priority overnight label. The destination was the elite event venue in the Hamptons. The recipient was the head coordinator with strict printed instructions that the package contained a high-value surprise presentation from the bride's sister and was to be delivered directly to the head table during the evening toasts. I handed the package to my firm's trusted courier. It was out of my hands now, moving swiftly toward its target. I walked out of my office and took a private car back to my apartment. I bypassed the drab gray dress hanging in my closet. Instead, I packed a designer suitcase with vibrant silk resort wear, expensive swimwear, and elegant evening attire. I opened my personal laptop and navigated to a luxury travel concierge portal. I booked a first-class direct flight out of JFK Airport. My destination was a 5-star oceanfront resort in Malibu, California. 2 hours later, I was sitting in the quiet serenity of the first-class lounge, sipping sparkling water with lime. The chaotic energy of my family felt like it belonged to a different universe. I watched the departure boards flash as flights prepared to cross the globe. I was putting nearly 3,000 miles between myself and the imminent explosion on the East Coast. I boarded the flight and settled into my spacious reclining suite. As the plane taxied down the runway and lifted into the night sky, looking down at the glittering grid of New York City, I felt a profound sense of peace. I was not fleeing. I was taking a heavily fortified position on high ground. The flight was smooth and entirely silent. I landed in Los Angeles to the welcoming warmth of the Pacific breeze. A private driver met me at the terminal and whisked me down the winding coastal highway toward Malibu. I checked into a massive corner suite with a wraparound balcony hovering directly over the crashing waves. I unpacked my designer clothes, ordered room service, and stepped out onto the balcony to breathe in the salty ocean air. It was Friday morning. Back in New York, my family was likely waking up in a state of frantic anticipation, preparing for the rehearsal dinner, while anxiously awaiting the arrival of my promised financial windfall. They were stepping blindly into the final 24 hours of their fabricated lives. I took a sip of fresh coffee and watched the tide roll in, completely unbothered by the storm I had just sent hurtling toward their shores. I transitioned from my morning coffee to a chilled margarita as the California sun climbed higher into the cloudless sky. The Malibu coastline stretched out before me in a brilliant panorama of sapphire water and golden sand. Seabirds coasted on the thermal drafts above the beach, and the rhythmic crash of the Pacific Ocean against the shore created a natural soundscape of absolute tranquility. It was Friday afternoon, exactly 24 hours before Brittany was scheduled to walk down the aisle in the Hamptons. On the East Coast, my family was currently engulfed in a highly pressurized environment of their own making. I sat on my plush lounge chair, feeling the warmth of the sun on my skin, entirely detached from the social obligations and fabricated emergencies that had dictated my life for over 3 decades. I had spent years allowing their manufactured crises to dictate my blood pressure. Now I was thousands of miles away, completely insulated by distance and truth. The serenity was not just environmental, it was deeply psychological. I had finally stopped trying to survive inside a burning building and simply walked out the front door. I placed my cocktail on the glass table beside me and opened my secure laptop. I booted up a secondary burner phone I had purchased specifically for this operation. I had routed all incoming messages from my primary number to a secure cloud server linked to this device. This setup allowed me to monitor their communications without ever showing a read receipt or indicating that my primary phone was completely disconnected. I typed in the decryption key and watched the notification center flood with incoming data. The sheer volume of frantic communication was staggering. Dozens of voicemails, hundreds of text messages, and a constant stream of alerts from the family group chat populated my screen. They were not messages of gratitude for the special final gift I had promised. They were messages of raw, escalating panic. The digital paper trail laid out a minute-by-minute timeline of a fraudulent operation rapidly falling apart. I opened the main text thread between my mother and sister. The cracks in their facade had split wide open. I read through the chronological panic. At 8 in the morning, Catherine had sent a message asking if I had wired the funds yet. By 10, the tone had shifted to irritation. By noon, the irritation had morphed into sheer terror. Without my $85,000 capital injection, the actual legitimate vendors operating the high society wedding were refusing to proceed. The fake invoice scam they ran on me had completely backfired. My family had assumed my money would arrive in Brittany's shell account, and they could immediately reroute those clean funds to pay off the real florists, the lighting technicians, and the high-end caterers who were actively setting up the Hamptons venue. They had overextended their non-existent credit to hire the absolute best vendors in New York to impress Donovan's elite family. Those premium vendors demanded final payment 24 hours before the event. When the transfers bounced, the vendors immediately halted their operations. I scrolled through a series of screenshots Brittany had forwarded to my mother in absolute hysteria. The lead floral designer responsible for the massive imported orchid installations had texted Brittany directly. The message plainly stated that his team was pulling the delivery trucks off the loading dock until the outstanding balance of $30,000 was cleared in full. Another message from the luxury catering director threatened to cancel the imported seafood order entirely. My sister and parents had played a highly dangerous game of financial chicken, and they had just lost. They constructed a phantom company to extort me, believing they could use my money to patch the massive holes in their actual event budget. But because I severed contact and vanished, their entire cash flow strategy evaporated instantly. The very vendors they hired to project an image of limitless wealth were now threatening to walk off the job, exposing them as complete frauds to the venue staff and potentially to Donovan himself. I watched the text messages continue to roll in live. Brittany's messages were entirely unhinged. She typed in all capital letters demanding to know why my bank had not processed the transfer. She accused me of submitting the wire incorrectly. She demanded I call my bank manager immediately to expedite the funds. She even threatened to send Donovan's personal security team to my Manhattan apartment to force me to log into my accounts. It was a fascinating display of narcissistic delusion. Even as her fraudulent empire collapsed around her, she still firmly believed I was simply an incompetent subordinate, failing to execute her commands properly. She could not fathom that I had intentionally detonated the bridge she was currently standing on. Catherine attempted to manage the fallout, suggesting they stall the vendors by claiming a bank error caused by the large transfer amount. But high-end vendors catering to the billionaire class do not accept bank errors as an excuse. They deal with extreme wealth daily, and they know that real money moves instantly. The desperation leaping off my secure screen was palpable. They were scrambling to find any available credit line, desperately trying to shift funds from empty accounts to satisfy the angry event coordinators. The Hamptons venue was likely a war zone of half-assembled floral arches and idle catering staff. I took another sip of my drink, savoring the perfect balance of sweet and sour. My family had demanded I sit quietly in a dark corner to protect their reputation. Now they were standing in the middle of a prestigious venue, completely exposed and humiliated by their own empty wallets. The wedding was actively unraveling 24 hours before the first guest was scheduled to arrive. But the vendor crisis was just the surface-level symptom of a much deeper, fatal disease. The real catastrophe was happening on a much larger financial scale. As I navigated away from the text threads to check the incoming voicemails, I saw exactly what I had been waiting for. The primary architect of the entire fraud was finally realizing he had lost his only shield. I clicked play on the first voicemail from Harrison. The audio began with a heavy sigh, a sound clearly engineered to project paternal exhaustion rather than the sheer terror I knew he was experiencing. The timestamp showed he had left this message early Thursday morning, right before his deadline with the predatory lenders expired. "Meredith, it is your father." His voice echoed through the small speaker of my laptop, attempting to maintain a facade of executive control. "We have a slight administrative delay on our end. My primary broker is requiring the physical deed to the Rhode Island property to finalize a routine portfolio transfer. It is just a basic compliance check for the prenuptial asset disclosure. I need you to overnight the signed transfer documents immediately. Do not delay this any further. Call me the second you send them." He was still trying to play the part of the wealthy tycoon experiencing a minor bureaucratic hiccup. He genuinely believed he could still con me into handing over my grandfather's legacy by wrapping his demand in sophisticated financial jargon. He thought using words like portfolio transfer and compliance check would pacify a forensic accountant. It was an insulting display of arrogance. I deleted the message and moved to the next recording in the queue. This one was timestamped 4 hours later. The false executive calm had completely evaporated. The hard money lenders must have officially rejected his fraudulent loan application when he failed to produce the physical collateral. "Where are the papers, Meredith?" Harrison bellowed into the receiver, his voice cracking with intense, frantic rage. "I checked the tracking numbers, and nothing has arrived. My associates cannot process the capital injection without that deed. Donovan's legal team is demanding the final schedule of assets by tomorrow morning. Do you understand what you are doing to me? Do you have any idea what kind of position you are putting this family in? You are deliberately trying to destroy your sister's wedding to satisfy your own petty, vindictive ego. I swear to God I will drag you through the courts until you have absolutely nothing left. Send the deed right now." I listened to his aggressive threats without a single spike in my heart rate. His anger was utterly impotent. He was a man standing on a trapdoor, screaming at the person holding the lever. The prenuptial asset review was the immovable wall he had finally crashed into. Without the cash from my cabin to artificially inflate his barren corporate accounts, Donovan's elite financial advisors would see nothing but a black hole of debt and offshore gambling losses. Harrison was cornered, and his rage was simply the byproduct of a predator realizing it was caught. The third voicemail was left just after midnight. The transformation in his tone was stark and pathetic. The aggressive, roaring tycoon had been replaced by a broken, weeping shell of a man. "Please," Harrison sobbed into the phone, his breath hitching audibly. "Meredith, please pick up the phone. I am begging you as your father. I am completely out of options. The lenders locked me out. The accounts are completely empty. Donovan's lawyers are going to pull the records in a few hours, and if they see the balance, they are going to cancel everything. They will ruin me. I could go to prison, Meredith. You have to save me. Please, just sign the house over. I will pay you back. I promise I will find a way to pay you back. You cannot do this to your own blood. Please save us." I sat in the bright Malibu sunlight, listening to a grown man cry over the consequences of his own calculated felonies. For my entire life, he had treated me like an insignificant disappointment. He had mocked my career, dismissed my achievements, and happily participated in my emotional isolation. Now he was reduced to weeping into a voicemail begging the daughter he discarded to shield him from federal fraud charges. There was no pity in my chest. There was only the clinical satisfaction of a closed audit. My phone screen lit up with another barrage of notifications, pulling my attention away from the pathetic audio recordings. Brittany was back on the offensive. The reality of her unpaid vendors was crashing down on her perfect Hamptons venue, and her panic was manifesting as pure digital hysteria. I opened the messaging app and watched the text blocks flood the screen in real time. "Where is the money?" she demanded using entirely capitalized letters. "The event coordinator just told me the floral team is packing up their trucks. They are literally taking the centerpieces away because you did not wire the cash." A few seconds later, another message appeared. "The florists are leaving. The catering director says they will not unload the seafood without the $85,000. People are starting to ask questions. Donovan's mother is already looking at me like I am garbage. Then came the final manic accusation. You ruined my life. You planned this. You did this on purpose to humiliate me. You are an absolute monster, Meredith. I will never forgive you for this. I stared at the glowing screen. She was blaming me for failing to fund a fraudulent shell company she created to steal my money. She was blaming me because the luxury vendors she hired with stolen venture capital were finally demanding actual payment. Her entire life was built on deception, and the moment reality demanded the bill, she immediately pointed the finger at the only person who refused to participate in the lie. I did not type a response. I did not offer an explanation or defend my actions. I simply placed the phone down on the glass table and looked out at the Pacific Ocean. The waves crashed heavily against the shoreline below my balcony, sending white sea foam rushing across the golden sand. The rhythm of the water was ancient, powerful, and completely indifferent to human chaos. I took a deep breath of the salty air, letting the warm coastal sun wash over my face. I had spent 34 years drowning in my family's toxic expectations, trying to keep my head above water while they actively pushed me under. I had exhausted myself trying to navigate their stormy, unpredictable moods. Now the tables were permanently turned. They had sailed their ship into a hurricane of their own making, and they were furiously bailing water from a vessel that was already sinking. They were screaming for a lifeboat, but I had already cut the ropes. I leaned back in my lounge chair, picked up my chilled margarita, and closed my eyes. The silence on my end was absolute. I was not going to save them. I was not going to argue with them. I was just going to sit in paradise and let them drown in the chaos of their own making. Tomorrow was the wedding day, and the real storm had not even made landfall yet. Saturday morning broke across the Malibu coastline in a brilliant wash of gold and azure, bringing with it the dawn of my sister's highly anticipated wedding day. I woke up feeling entirely refreshed after the first full 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep I had experienced in weeks. I booted up my laptop and immediately navigated to the FedEx Secure Tracking Portal. I typed in the 32-digit tracking sequence attached to the velvet presentation box I had shipped from Manhattan. The package was currently sitting on a delivery truck navigating the winding exclusive roads of the Hamptons. It was heading straight toward an ultra-elite high-security beachfront estate that Donovan had rented for the weekend. I knew the security protocols for an event of this magnitude would be incredibly strict, but I had designed my delivery to bypass those exact protocols. I paid a premium for specialized white-glove courier handling. The exterior packaging was wrapped in pristine silver paper, sealed with wax and explicitly marked as highly fragile confidential wedding day jewelry from the bride's immediate family. I knew Donovan's security personnel were trained to intercept physical threats, not to confiscate highly personal, expensive jewelry gifts sent directly by the bride's sister. The psychological manipulation of the packaging worked exactly as I had calculated. No security guard was going to tear open a sealed luxury gift explicitly addressed to the bride an hour before the ceremony. The courier truck icon on my map slowly crept down the digital highway, inching closer and closer to the heavily fortified gates of the venue. I watched the GPS coordinates update every 10 seconds. The tension in the air was palpable even from 3,000 miles away. If my package was intercepted or inspected too closely by an overly zealous security guard, my entire technological ambush would be dismantled before it even began. I needed that velvet box to be placed securely inside the main reception hall, completely untouched until the evening toasts commenced. The digital truck icon finally arrived at the address, stopping at the geographical pin representing the estate. I stared at the screen, waiting for the final scan. 5 minutes passed, then 10. My forensic accounting brain calculated the exact time it would take a courier to clear the front gate, verify credentials, and locate the head coordinator. At exactly 11:14 in the morning, the web page auto-refreshed. A bright green banner flashed across the top of my monitor. Delivered. Signed for by event coordinator. A surge of pure clinical satisfaction coursed through my veins. The Trojan horse was officially inside the fortress walls. The automated iPad carrying the entire financial truth of my family's criminal conspiracy was now sitting securely in the hands of the venue staff, waiting to be placed directly in front of Brittany and Donovan. My parents had spent weeks trying to forcefully eject me from their narrative. Now my digital proxy was locked and loaded right in the center of their opulent celebration. I closed the shipping portal and opened a proprietary encrypted streaming application on my secondary monitor. I needed visual confirmation of the detonation. While the iPad was programmed to automatically hijack the audio-visual system upon opening it, did not have a built-in camera angle that could capture the entire room. For that, I needed a man on the inside. I needed someone physically present in the reception hall who had zero loyalty to my parents and a strong desire to see their pretentious facade crumble. I had found the exact perfect operative in Cousin Gregory. My mother had explicitly threatened to banish me to Table 42 to sit with him and Aunt Beatrice because they were the estranged black sheep of the family. Gregory despised Harrison and Catherine. He deeply resented their decades of condescension and their constant flaunting of fabricated wealth. On Wednesday afternoon before I left New York, I securely wired Gregory $500 with a very specific set of instructions. I overnighted him a discreet high-definition lapel camera hidden inside a standard tuxedo lapel pin. I instructed him to attach it to his suit jacket and ensure he had a clear, unobstructed line of sight to the head table and the massive projector screens stationed behind it. Gregory was more than happy to facilitate the surveillance, especially since it meant securing a front-row seat to the downfall of the relatives who had treated him like garbage for his entire life. I typed the unique IP address linked to Gregory's lapel camera into my streaming software. The connection protocol initiated bouncing my signal through 2 proxy servers to ensure absolute anonymity. The loading wheel spun for a few seconds before the screen faded from black into sharp, vibrant, high-definition color. The video feed was perfectly stable. Gregory had successfully infiltrated the reception hall ahead of the general guest admission. Through the lens of his hidden camera, I could see the sheer, staggering opulence of the Hamptons venue. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, casting brilliant light over dozens of round tables draped in pristine white silk. The floral arrangements were massive, towering structures of imported white orchids and cascading greenery. I noted with a cold smile that several of the floral arches near the entrance looked suspiciously sparse. It perfectly aligned with the frantic texts I had read yesterday about the vendors threatening to pull their inventory over unpaid balances. It was clear my mother had managed to scrape together just enough credit to keep the absolute minimum amount of decor in place, but the extravagant luxury they had promised Donovan was visibly lacking. The financial rot was already beginning to show. Waitstaff in immaculate black and white uniforms hurried across the room, making final adjustments to the silverware and crystal champagne flutes. I could hear the ambient sound of string musicians tuning their instruments in the background. The audio feed was crystal clear, picking up the low hum of stressed venue coordinators barking last-minute orders into their headsets. I scanned the room through Gregory's subtle movements until the camera lens centered perfectly on the elevated head table. It was draped in shimmering fabric, positioned directly beneath the 2 massive projection screens Donovan had likely rented to display their perfectly curated engagement photos. Sitting right in the center of that pristine head table, perfectly aligned with the bride's designated seat, was my pristine, silver-wrapped box. The event coordinator had followed the delivery instructions flawlessly. The package was waiting exactly where it needed to be. It looked entirely innocent, just another lavish gift in a room filled with extreme wealth. Nobody in that hall had the slightest inkling that beneath the silver wrapping paper sat a digital bomb capable of hijacking the venue's entire network. I leaned back against the plush cushions of my balcony chair and closed my encrypted communication tabs. I poured myself a fresh glass of iced sparkling water, dropped a slice of lime into the glass, and adjusted the volume on my speakers. The guests would be arriving shortly. the speeches were scheduled to begin in just a few hours. The absolute destruction of Harrison Heritage Holdings and the permanent cancellation of my family's fraudulent dynasty was fully armed and ticking down. I took a slow, refreshing sip of my drink, keeping my eyes locked on the live feed, and waited for the show to begin. The countdown had officially reached 0. Brittany lifted the lid of the velvet box with a dramatic sweeping gesture, ensuring every single eye in the opulent reception hall was focused entirely on her. She expected to find a stack of crisp bank checks and a heavy notarized property deed wrapped in silk ribbons. Instead, her perfectly manicured hands reached into the box and pulled out a sleek, customized iPad. Resting on the molded velvet insert, the device was wired to a high-frequency auto-syncing Bluetooth transmitter. I had programmed the tablet with an aggressive, overriding digital script. The exact second ambient light hit the optical sensor, the tablet powered on and instantly flooded the venue's wireless network. It aggressively bypassed the reception hall's basic security firewalls and forcibly paired itself with the master audiovisual control board. Through Gregory's lapel camera, I watched the immediate environmental shift. The soft, romantic golden lighting that had bathed the room abruptly cut to a harsh, dim setting. A collective murmur of confusion rippled through the seated guests. Before the event coordinators could even reach for their two-way radios to correct what they assumed was a technical glitch, the two massive projection screens suspended directly behind the head table flared to life with blinding, stark white intensity. Bold blood-red letters spanned across the 50-foot digital displays illuminating the entire room. Financial fraud investigation. The low hum of polite conversation vanished. The silence in the room became absolute and suffocating. Donovan leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowing as he stared up at the towering screen. He turned to look at Brittany, expecting her to explain the bizarre, aggressive presentation. But Brittany was completely frozen, her eyes locked on the glowing iPad in her hands, as if it were a live grenade. Then the venue's state-of-the-art surround sound speakers cracked to life with deafening volume. The crystal-clear, unmistakable voice of my mother, Catherine, echoed off the vaulted ceilings, rebounding across the crystal chandeliers. You have exactly 48 hours to sign that property transfer and wire the $85,000. A collective gasp echoed from the front tables where Donovan's parents sat in stunned disbelief. The recording transitioned seamlessly into the next extracted audio clip. Brittany's own voice now filled the expansive room, sounding arrogant, scheming, and entirely unhinged. Since she has been out of contact for so long, we should be able to claim her portion was forfeited. It will take some time, but the lawyer is confident we can make it work. She made her choice when she dropped out. That money is better off with someone who actually did something with their education. The elite guests, politicians, and tech executives sat in horrified silence. The elegant, independent, self-made woman they had been introduced to was currently broadcasting her own felony conspiracy to steal a family trust fund. Brittany's hands began to shake violently. She stared at the iPad, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. The automated forensic presentation did not pause for her to recover. The massive screens flashed to the next slide, displaying the verified sealed Chapter 7 bankruptcy filings. The bright yellow highlighter marks I had added drew every eye in the room directly to the bottom line. Net worth 0. Assets completely liquidated. The visual proof that the affluent high society family Donovan was marrying into was legally destitute hung above them for everyone to read. The presentation clicked forward again. This time it displayed the wire transfer logs from Harrison Heritage Holdings. Donovan's own corporate letterhead appeared on the screen, showing the exact $500,000 capital injection he had made into my father's supposedly booming real estate firm. The slide immediately split in half. On the right side, the screen detailed the exact outbound routing numbers. Offshore sports betting syndicates in Malta. High-interest loan shark accounts in Nevada. The itemized credit card statements paying for the very custom wedding dress Brittany was currently wearing. Harrison's face drained of all color. He looked like a man who had just suffered a massive cardiac event. He grabbed the edge of the head table, his knuckles turning bone white, completely unable to form a single word of defense. His fabricated empire was completely dismantled in front of the very financial titans he had spent the evening trying to impress. Catherine covered her face with her trembling hands, shrinking down into her chair, as the elite society women stared at her with open, undisguised disgust. The sheer reality of her total destruction finally broke through Brittany's state of paralysis. The flawless facade shattered completely. She let out a piercing, guttural scream of absolute terror that reverberated through the microphone stand next to her. She lunged forward, grasping the iPad with manic force. She slammed the device onto the polished marble floor, raising the heel of her designer shoe to stomp on the glass screen. She stomped on it repeatedly, screaming incoherent obscenities, desperately trying to kill the audio feed. The glass shattered under her heel, splintering across the floor, but the Bluetooth transmission had already cached the entire presentation directly into the venue's mainframe. The audio continued to blare, and the financial receipts remained glowing brilliantly on the massive screens. I watched Donovan through the encrypted live stream. The transformation was chilling and magnificent. The warm, loving groom vanished entirely in the blink of an eye. In his place sat a ruthless, highly analytical billionaire CEO who had just realized he was the central target of a massive financial con. He did not yell. He did not act out in anger or confront my father. His face became an impenetrable mask of cold, calculated fury. He slowly stood up from the head table, buttoning his tuxedo jacket with precise, deliberate movements. He looked down at Brittany, who was now sobbing hysterically on the floor, among the shattered glass, ruining her expensive gown. He did not offer her a hand. He did not offer a single word of comfort. Donovan turned his gaze toward the back of the room, raising his hand and delivering a swift, sharp, tactical signal. Instantly, his private security detail moved into action. 6 heavily built men in tailored suits stepped forward from the shadows, physically blocking the heavy wooden exit doors of the reception hall. The room was officially locked down. My family was trapped inside the very cage they had built, surrounded by hundreds of witnesses and a man who had the absolute power and capital to ensure they paid for every single lie. Donovan finally stepped away from the elevated head table. The room was deathly quiet, save for Brittany's frantic gasping. He walked toward the brass microphone. The captivated audience watched in absolute silence. He tapped the microphone once. His voice projected absolute authority. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the abrupt disruption to this evening." He did not look at Brittany. "As you have just witnessed, it appears my corporate and personal accounts have been severely compromised by a highly coordinated fraud scheme. Effective immediately, this wedding is canceled." Gasps erupted from the crowd, but Donovan raised a hand. "I respectfully ask that you enjoy the catering and the bar for the remainder of the night. My security team will assist you with transportation when you are ready to depart." He then walked over to the velvet presentation box. Inside, beneath the shattered iPad, rested a thick stack of printed executive summaries. He handed the physical dossiers to his lead corporate counsel. "Freeze all connected accounts and review these findings," Donovan instructed. "Do not let a single dollar move from my accounts." Harrison tried to run. He shoved his chair back and dashed toward the side exit, abandoning his wife and daughter. But the security detail was already in place. 2 large men intercepted him, pinning his arms to his sides. The sirens became audible a few moments later. The wailing sound cut through the tense atmosphere of the reception hall. Donovan's legal team had not wasted a second. They had immediately contacted the local authorities regarding the $500,000 wire fraud. Uniformed police officers breached the main doors, their radios crackling. Donovan's lawyers met them halfway, handing over the printed bank statements and the offshore routing numbers. The officers marched straight to the head table. Catherine tried to scream, demanding they unhand her, claiming she was a respected member of high society who belonged in this elite circle. She frantically threatened to sue the police department and demanded to speak to the manager of the venue as if this were a simple customer service dispute rather than a federal crime scene. Her protests fell on deaf ears as the cold metal handcuffs snapped shut around her wrists. Harrison was dragged back into the center of the room, his face buried in his chest to hide from the dozens of cell phone cameras recording his humiliating downfall. The affluent guest who had shaken his hand just an hour ago now whispered in absolute disgust, pointing at the sweating, ruined man being hauled away by law enforcement. Their grand illusion was dead. Brittany remained on the floor. Her custom gown was torn and stained with spilled champagne. She reached out for Donovan, begging him to listen, begging for one more chance to explain. He did not even look down. He simply turned his back and walked out of the hall alongside his parents, leaving her entirely alone in the wreckage of her own making. The live feed cut out shortly after leaving my screen pitch black. I closed my laptop and listened to the soothing sound of the ocean. The storm I had unleashed was officially over. A week passed in absolute tranquility. I spent my days swimming in the Pacific and my evenings reading on the balcony. My burner phone remained completely silent. My parents were facing severe federal indictments, and Brittany was dealing with the collapse of her entire fabricated world. They had no resources left to hunt me down or harass me. On Friday afternoon, my secure corporate phone rang. The caller ID displayed Donovan's private number. I accepted the call, stepping out onto the sunlit deck. Meredith. His voice was incredibly calm, carrying the exhausted but relieved tone of a man who had just survived a major collision. I hope I am not interrupting your vacation. Not at all, Donovan, I replied smoothly. How are the audits proceeding? Flawlessly, thanks to you, he said. My legal team verified every single document you provided in that velvet box. The authorities recovered a fraction of the funds, but the vast majority was already lost to the offshore casinos. Still, you saved me from merging my entire portfolio with a family of predators. You saved me from a multi-million-dollar catastrophe. I simply followed the data I stated. As a forensic accountant, it was my professional obligation to report those liabilities. Donovan let out a short, genuine laugh. It was brilliant. The delivery, the timing, the inescapable proof. It was a masterclass in accountability. In fact, my board of directors was so thoroughly impressed by your investigative precision that we have made a unanimous decision. We want to officially retain your firm for all of our future corporate acquisitions. We want you leading the due diligence. I smiled, watching a pair of seabirds glide over the crashing waves. My family had spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was a worthless, socially unfit disappointment. They tried to diminish my career and steal my hard-earned assets. Instead, my career had just secured a massive, lucrative contract with one of the most powerful tech conglomerates in the country. I will have my managing partner send over the engagement letters on Monday, I told Donovan. We exchanged polite goodbyes and ended the call. I set the phone down on the glass table and looked out at the vibrant, glowing sunset painting the Malibu sky in shades of orange and violet. I had protected my grandfather's legacy, ensuring his beachfront cabin remained safe from predatory loan sharks. I had saved an innocent, hardworking man from absolute financial and emotional ruin. Most importantly, I had surgically excised the toxic cancer from my own life. I was completely free. The best revenge is never anger. It is the cold, hard truth backed by legally admissible evidence. Have you ever had to use sheer logic to destroy a toxic family member's lies? Tell me your story below. The story of Meredith dismantling her family's fraudulent empire offers a profound masterclass in recognizing and neutralizing toxic relationships. For generations, society has conditioned us to believe that blood ties demand unconditional loyalty. We are actively taught to endure manipulation, financial abuse, and emotional neglect simply because the perpetrators happen to share our DNA. However, the most empowering lesson drawn from this narrative is that biological connection does not grant anyone immunity from accountability. When a family operates as a parasitic entity demanding your sacrifices while offering nothing but disdain, walking away is not an act of betrayal. It is a necessary act of essential self-preservation. Meredith's journey teaches us that the ultimate response to emotional manipulation is cold, unshakable logic. Toxic individuals thrive in the chaotic environments they actively create. They use frantic demands, aggressive ultimatums, and manufactured guilt to force their victims into submission. By stepping out of the emotional battlefield and treating her family's extortion attempt like a literal corporate fraud investigation, Meredith stripped them of their only weapon. She refused to play the role of the desperate approval seeking daughter. Instead, she let the undeniable facts and hard data speak for themselves. This monumental shift from emotional reaction to analytical execution is exactly what completely destroyed their fabricated reality. Ultimately, we learn that setting absolute boundaries is the only way to protect our peace, our hard earned assets, and our professional future. True family is built on a foundation of mutual respect and genuine support, not on extortion, jealousy, and deceit. When we stop funding the illusions of toxic people, we reclaim our own power and rewrite our own destinies without their heavy chains. Take a moment today to audit your own relationships and dare to cut ties with anyone who costs you your peace and self-worth.